Everyone remembers Stymie Beard, the charming boy in the oversized derby hat who defined the Little Rascals, but few know the devastating price he paid for our laughter. Behind that $1 million smile was a 5-year-old forced to support 14 people, only to be discarded by a segregated Hollywood and driven into 20 years of heroin addiction and prison. This isn't just a tragedy. It is the untold story of how the industry turned a black prodigy into a prisoner. The tragedy of Matthew Beard is inextricably bound to the geography of his world. If you were to look at a map of Los Angeles in 1930, you would see a city that was not just divided by neighborhoods, but carved up by invisible, ironclad walls. To the west lay the shimmering mirage of Hollywood, a land of manicured lawns, Spanish-style villas, and the intoxicating scent of orange blossoms. It was a factory of dreams that was churning out fantasies for a nation brought to its knees by the Great Depression. But if you traveled east, past the Art Deco spires of downtown, the pavement began to crack. The air grew heavy with dust and the smoke of burning trash. You would cross an invisible line, a red line, into East Los Angeles. This was not the Los Angeles of the postcards. This was a containment zone. In the grip of the 1930s, this was a place where hope had been rationed, and survival was a daily, brutal negotiation. It is here, in this suffocating grid of poverty, that our story begins. It does not begin with a spotlight or a red carpet or the applause of a studio audience. It begins with the hollow ache of hunger. The year is 1930. The stock market crash of the previous year has sent shockwaves through the American economy, shattering the working class. But in the African American communities of Los Angeles, the Depression was not merely a financial downturn. It was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. Unemployment rates in these neighborhoods soared past 50%. Families were doubling up, then tripling up in small, drafty wood frame houses, trying to keep the cold out and the despair at bay. Men who had once held steady jobs in the rail yards or the docks now stood in bread lines that stretched for blocks, their heads bowed in shame, waiting for a handout of stale loaves and watered-down soup. In this unforgiving landscape, a child was born not merely as a son or a daughter, but as a mouth to feed. In the brutal calculus of survival, a new baby was both a blessing from God and a terrifying economic liability. And if a family was lucky, if they were truly, miraculously lucky, that child might become something else entirely, a lifeline. Matthew Beard, Jr. was born into this precarious world on New Year's Day, 1925. He was the son of a minister, a man of God who preached salvation on Sundays, but faced the impossible mathematics of poverty on the other 6 days of the week. The Beard household was not just a home. It was a teeming, chaotic ecosystem that defied the laws of space and privacy. Matthew was one of 14 children. Let that number sink in for a moment. 14 children. In a modern context, that number is almost unfathomable. But in the 1930s, in a devout religious family, it was a reality. The Beard house was a cacophony of crying babies, shouting siblings, and the constant rhythmic drumming of chores. It was a place where silence was impossible and privacy was a luxury that no one could afford. But the most pressing issue was not noise, it was resources. In a time when a loaf of bread was a luxury and a quart of milk was a calculated expense, the Beard family was an army that needed to be provisioned every single day. The pressure within the walls of their home must have been suffocating. It was a pressure that Matthew, even as a toddler, absorbed into his very bones. Children are perceptive. They understand tension long before they understand language. Matthew learned to walk in a house where space was non existent. He learned to speak in a room where every object was shared. And he learned very early on a lesson that would define his entire existence. In a family of that size, you had to be useful to be seen. You had to contribute. The legend of how Matthew Beard found his way to Hollywood has been told many times, often wrapped in the sweet, sugary coating of a studio publicity myth. The official story goes that he simply wandered onto a movie set, a curious little boy chasing a dream, and was discovered by chance. But the truth is likely far more pragmatic and far more desperate. By 1930, the movie studios were the only factories in town that were still hiring. The talkies had arrived, and Hollywood was hungry for content. For a black family in East Los Angeles, a child who could dance, sing, or just smile on cue was not just a talented kid. They were a potential lottery ticket. They were a financial asset that could pull an entire clan out of the gutter. Matthew was just 5 years old when he walked through the imposing gates of the Hal Roach Studios in Culver City. He was there to audition for Our Gang, a series of comedy shorts that the world would later know and love as the Little Rascals. The show was a cultural phenomenon, a strange and wonderful experiment where children were allowed to be children, operating in a world almost entirely devoid of adult supervision. It was a chaotic, messy, hilarious reflection of American childhood. But for Matthew, stepping onto that lot was not stepping into a playground. It was stepping into a workplace. The director, Robert McGowan, was a man who had seen hundreds of children parade before him. He was tired of the stage mothers, women who curled their daughters' hair and taught their sons to recite lines with robotic, unnatural precision. He wanted something real. He wanted chaos. When Matthew walked in, he didn't perform. He didn't tap dance. He didn't recite a poem. He simply was. He had a nonchalance, a cool detachment that was startling in a 5-year-old. He walked with a swagger that seemed to say he had already seen everything the world had to offer, because in the slums of East LA, perhaps he already had. During that first encounter, McGowan watched the boy wander around the set, curiously inspecting the lights and the cameras, completely ignoring the frantic energy of the production. He didn't ask for permission. He just existed in the space. The director scratched his head, frustrated but fascinated. He reportedly turned to his assistant and said, "This kid stymies me. I can't figure him out." And just like that, Matthew Beard ceased to exist. In his place, Stymie was born. The name itself, meaning a hindrance, an obstacle, a problem to be solved, was prophetic. It was a moniker that unwittingly predicted the path the industry would force him to walk, a constant navigation of barriers placed in his way. The transformation was sealed with a single object, a hat. It is impossible to think of Stymie without thinking of the Derby. The story of that hat is a piece of Hollywood folklore that rings with a rare truth. It was gifted to the boy by none other than the legendary comedian Stan Laurel, of Laurel and Hardy fame, who worked on the same lot. Laurel, seeing the boy's bald head, shaved to prevent lice, a common scourge of poverty, placed his own bowler hat on Stymie. The hat was comically oversized. It slid down over Matthew's ears, threatening to swallow his entire head. A director concerned with continuity might have corrected this. A wardrobe mistress might have found a prop that fit. But someone saw the genius in the image. The hat didn't just look funny. It looked symbolic. It looked like a child trying to wear the responsibilities of a grown man. It was a visual metaphor for Stymie's life, a small boy carrying a burden far too big for him. Stymie Beard didn't just get the part, he became the anchor of the franchise. He replaced the previous star, Alan Farina Hoskins, inheriting the mantle of the black kid in the gang. But Stymie reinvented the archetype. While Farina had often been the butt of the joke, a character defined by fear and superstition, Stymie was sharp. He was the slick talker. He was the con artist with a heart of gold. When he spoke, he did so with a slow, deliberate drawl, often looking at the chaos around him with a heavy-lidded skepticism that delighted audiences. He was a natural. The camera loved him. The way he tilted that derby hat, the way he chewed on a blade of grass, the way he could deliver a punchline with nothing more than a shrug. It was pure cinema magic, and the reward for this magic was staggering. At the height of his fame, Stymie Beard was earning $250 a week. The sheer scale of this income becomes clear only when placed against the backdrop of 1932. The average American income was less than $20 a week. A grown man, breaking his back in a steel mill or a coal mine, would have to work for 3 months to earn what this 5-year-old boy earned in 5 days. In today's currency, Stymie was pulling in the equivalent of nearly $5,000 a week. He wasn't just rich, he was a tycoon in short pants. He was out-earning bankers, lawyers, and doctors. But here lies the first deep tragedy of Stymie Beard's life. It is a tragedy of economics, and it is a tragedy of exploitation. Stymie never saw the money. Crucially, the legal protections for child stars simply did not exist yet. The famous Coogan Law, designed to protect a child's earnings, wouldn't be passed until 1939, 4 years after Stymie left the show. He was unprotected by the state, leaving his fortune entirely vulnerable. But in the 1930s, these laws were porous. They were filled with loopholes. And critically, for a black family navigating a segregated legal system, they were practically non-existent. The courts rarely looked closely at the finances of black families. The studio accountants didn't care where the money went. As long as the talent showed up on time, the checks were cut, yes, but they were not deposited into a trust fund for Matthew's future education. They were not set aside for his adulthood. Instead, that money flowed directly from the payroll office at Hal Roach Studios into the hands of the Beard family parents. And from there, it evaporated. It didn't disappear into luxury cars or mansions. It disappeared into the insatiable needs of 14 people. Stymie's salary paid the rent on the house in East Los Angeles. It bought the groceries that fed his brothers and sisters. It bought the clothes on their backs and the shoes on their feet. It paid the tithes at his father's church. Imagine for a moment the psychological weight on a child of that age. Most 5-year-olds are concerned with the monsters under their bed or whether they can have a second scoop of ice cream. Stymie Beard lived with the subconscious knowledge that he was the structure holding the roof up. If he wasn't funny today, if he didn't make the director laugh, if he lost his job, his family would starve. His brothers would go hungry. His sisters would have no shoes. He became what sociologists call a parentified child. The roles were reversed. He was the provider, the patriarch in miniature. His father, the minister, may have held the spiritual authority in the home, preaching from the pulpit on Sundays. But it was the little boy in the derby hat who held the economic power, yet possessed none of the control. He was an employee of his own family. This dynamic created a profound aching isolation. On the screen, Stymie was the center of the gang, surrounded by friends like Spanky, Alfalfa, and Dickie Moore. But when the cameras stopped rolling, he entered a strange limbo. Hal Roach Studios was often called the Lot of Fun. It was marketed as a paradise for children. But Stymie couldn't relate to the carefree nature of his white co-stars. Many of them came from families that, while not wealthy, were not destitute. They were building careers. Stymie was building a survival raft. He couldn't relate to the kids in his neighborhood back in East LA. They were playing stickball in the street, scraping their knees, and living the rough and tumble lives of normal boys. Stymie was waking up at dawn, memorizing lines, and working 10-hour days under hot studio lights. He couldn't relate to the adults. They looked at him not as a child to be nurtured, but as an asset to be managed and maintained. He was a commodity like a racehorse or a prize fighter. Decades later, a scarred and weary Matthew Beard would sit in a small room at the Synanon Rehabilitation Center and reflect on those golden years. His voice, ravaged by time and hardship, would deliver a line more heartbreaking than any scriptwriter could have invented. It is the thesis statement of his entire life. He said, "I never played marbles. I never played tag. I worked from the time I was 2 years old." Think about the simplicity of marbles. It is a game of zero consequence. You win, you lose, it doesn't matter. It is the definition of childhood leisure. It is the freedom to waste time. Stymie Beard was denied the luxury of zero consequence. Every moment of his young life was transactional. His smile was a transaction. His charm was a transaction. His very childhood was sold hour by hour to the American public, and the public consumed him voraciously. They bought the tickets. They laughed at his antics. They loved him, but it was a selfish love. They loved the character of Stymie, the carefree rascal who lived in a world without consequences. They did not see, or perhaps they chose not to see, the exhausted little boy behind the character, the one who was carrying the weight of the Great Depression on his small, fragile shoulders. In the studio commissary, Stymie would sit and eat his lunch, often separated from the crew by the invisible but ironclad laws of social segregation. To the casual observer, it looked like a paradise. Here were children living the dream, famous and adored. But looking back with the clarity of history, we can see the cracks in the foundation. We can see a system that was perfectly designed to extract value from a human being until there was nothing left. For the Beard family, Stymie was a miracle. He was the answer to their prayers. He was the food on the table. But in the ruthless calculus of Hollywood, childhood is a depreciating asset. And for a black child in a white world, the expiration date comes sooner and with far more brutality than anyone expects. The boy in the derby hat was about to learn that in Hollywood, you are only loved as long as you are useful. And he was about to learn that growing up was not a natural process, but an unforgivable sin. The sun was setting on the lot of fun, and the long shadow of reality was about to catch up with Stymie Beard. Beyond the financial drain of his household lay a more insidious cage, the studio itself. While the lot of fun projected an image of racial harmony to a segregated nation, the reality for Matthew was a daily exercise in cognitive dissonance. It was a radical experiment, perhaps the most subversive artistic statement of the 1930s. In an era when the Ku Klux Klan marched openly and the laws of Jim Crow strictly separated black and white bodies, our gang presented a different reality. On screen, Stymie played alongside Spanky and Dickie Moore as an equal. He wasn't a servant, he was a ringleader. But the tragedy lies in the brutal distance between that projected image and the lived reality. The camera lens acted as a filter, removing the toxins of society. But the moment the director yelled, "Cut," the poisonous atmosphere of 1930s America rushed back in. The studio was a landscape of cognitive dissonance. Consider the simple biological act of drinking water. On the hot, dusty sound stages of Culver City, thirst was constant. For Spanky or Alfalfa, it was simple. For Stymie, it was a navigational hazard. He had to know exactly which fountain was his. If he forgot for a second that he was colored and drank from the white fountain, the indulgent smiles of the crew would vanish, replaced by the icy stare of racial policing. He was a child who had to memorize his lines, but he also had to memorize his place. Lunchtime was an even more theatrical display of this segregation. While the white children sat at the main tables, celebrated and surrounded by doting mothers, Stymie was often relegated to a separate area, sometimes eating with the kitchen staff or in a designated colored section. He was a leader on screen, but a contaminant off it. Imagine the psychological fragmentation this caused in a boy of 6 or 7. One minute, you are the leader of the gang. The next, you are holding a tray, unable to sit down. You are taught repeatedly and brutally that your value is conditional. This separation extended to education, a detail often overlooked in the biographies of child stars. The studio was legally required to provide schooling for the minors on the lot. For the white children, this meant a structured classroom environment with tutors who ensured they were keeping up with their grade level. They were being prepared for a future beyond the studio. For Stymie, education was an afterthought. While he attended the classes, the expectations placed upon him were radically different. The implicit bias of the era dictated that a black boy didn't need to learn algebra or history. He just needed to know how to read his script. He was being trained to be an employee, not a scholar. This dynamic became even more harrowing when the Rascals went on tour. To promote the films, the studio would send the children across the country for personal appearances. They traveled by train, waving to crowds at whistle stops, receiving the adoration of the public. But the train tracks ran through the heart of the Jim Crow South. The tour was marketed as a victory lap, but for Stymie, it was a tour of humiliation. When the train crossed the Mason-Dixon line, the rules changed. On the train itself, while the white cast members slept in plush Pullman sleeper cars with fresh linens in attendance, Stymie and his father, who often chaperoned him, were frequently forced into the Jim Crow car. This was usually the car directly behind the coal engine, noisy, dirty, and filled with smoke. Upon arriving in a city like Atlanta, Birmingham, or Memphis, the group would be greeted by cheering fans. The irony was palpable. The white crowds cheered for Stymie the character, but the city statutes forbade Stymie the boy from entering their hotels. There is a specific heartbreaking rhythm to these nights. The white children, Spanky, Alfalfa, Darla, would be whisked away to the finest luxury hotels in the city, where they slept in feather beds, ordered room service, and swam in the pool. Stymie was not allowed to cross the threshold of the lobby. He would be separated from the group and taken to Colored Town to stay in a boarding house or a small segregated hotel that often lacked basic amenities. In some smaller towns where no such accommodation existed, he was forced to sleep on the bus or in the train car alone. The next morning, he would be collected, brushed off, put back in his derby hat, and reunited with the group as if nothing had happened. He was expected to smile, to wave, to be the happy-go-lucky Paganini that the audience paid to see, all while shaking off the cold humiliation of the previous night. He was shielding the white public from the ugliness of their own laws. We have spoken of the financial abuse Stymie suffered at home, but to understand the full scope of his tragedy, we must look at the institutional betrayal by the state of California. This was not just a case of greedy parents. It was a case of a legal system that selectively applied protection based on skin color. The Coogan Law, established in 1939, and its precursors, was designed to prevent the exploitation of child actors. It empowered the courts to set aside a portion of a child's earnings in a blocked trust. When white stars like Jackie Cooper or Shirley Temple made millions, the court system hovered over them like a protective hawk. Judges would audit their accounts, appoint financial guardians, and ensure that their future was secured. Society viewed these white children as precious assets that needed to be shepherded into adulthood. Stymie Beard received no such protection. To the legal system and to the studio executives, he was not a child star in the same sense. He was a laborer. He was a novelty act. The unspoken assumption was that a black child did not need a trust fund because he did not have a future that required one. The expectations for his adulthood were low. Why save money for college or a future business when society expected him to eventually become a porter or a janitor? The benign neglect of the court system allowed his earnings to be drained without oversight. The studio accountants knew the money wasn't reaching the boy, but they didn't intervene. The judges knew the law wasn't being applied, but they didn't care. It was a form of economic violence that was rendered invisible because it happened to a black boy. The system didn't fail Stymie. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work for a person of his color. And yet, children are not born with prejudice. They must be taught it. In the gaps between the adults' surveillance, genuine friendships formed. This is the bittersweetness of the Our Gang story. Stymie and Dickie Moore, in particular, shared a bond that transcended the color line. Years later, Moore would write poignantly about his confusion. He recalled a specific moment when he invited Stymie to his house for dinner. His mother hesitated, then agreed, but the neighbors stared. Dickie noted that he didn't even know Stymie was black, a concept he didn't culturally understand, until an adult pointed it out with a sneer. To the kids, Stymie was just the funny guy with the cool hat who knew how to play dice better than anyone else. The tragedy is that the adults were constantly working to dismantle this innocence. They were the architects of the barrier. The white mothers on set, the stage moms, often viewed Stymie with a mixture of professional jealousy and racial suspicion. They tolerated him as a prop, a necessary ingredient for the commercial success of the film, but they policed the boundaries of intimacy with hawk-like vigilance. They didn't want their children getting too close. As the mid-1930s approached, the mask began to slip. Resistance takes a toll. Wearing a mask of happiness for 12 hours a day eats away at the soul. And as Stymie grew, the mask began to feel heavier. The passage of time is the enemy of every child actor, but for Stymie, it was a death sentence. By 1935, the adorable roundness of his face began to lengthen. His legs grew lanky. The baby fat that made his skepticism cute was melting away, revealing the features of a young man. In the twisted logic of Hollywood casting, a small black child was a pet. A black adolescent was a threat. The camaraderie on the set began to curdle. The white children were growing up too, and the social pressures of the outside world were beginning to bleed into the studio. The innocent games of tag stopped. The distinct lines of segregation became harder to ignore. Stymie could feel the shift in the air. The directors were less patient. The writers struggled to find things for him to do. He was becoming too big for the derby hat, both literally and metaphorically. He was approaching the age of 10. In any other life, this is a golden age, the beginning of true independence, of riding bicycles and discovering the world. For Stymie Beard, it was the beginning of the end. He was standing on a precipice. Behind him was the false paradise of the lot of fun, a place where he was a star but not a citizen. Ahead of him was the abyss of the real world, a world that had no use for a black child who had forgotten his place. The studio had already begun the search for his replacement. They weren't looking for an actor with Stymie's specific talent or charisma. They were looking for a type, a visual gag. Someone who could wear the clothes and take the abuse without the problem of growing up. They found Billy Buckwheat Thomas. The transition was being prepared in the corporate offices, coldly and efficiently. The machinery of Hollywood was getting ready to eject Stymie Beard, to strip him of his status, and to send him back to the poverty he had worked so hard to escape. The boy who had supported a family of 14, who had endured the Jim Crow trains and the segregated lunches, was about to find out that to the industry he served, he was nothing more than a disposable commodity with an expiration date. But the most agonizing mechanism of Stymie Beard's downfall was not written in a contract. It was written in his DNA. In the Hollywood jungle, the most ruthless predator is not the studio boss or the critic. It is the law of biology. For a child star, time is not a river. It is a predator. Every inch of height gained, every tooth lost, every octave dropped in the voice is a betrayal of the contract signed with the audience. But for a black child star in the 1930s, this law was enforced with a cruelty that was distinct, racialized, and absolute. By 1935, Matthew Beard was 10 years old. In a normal childhood, double digits are a milestone, a celebration of growing independence. But inside the gates of Hal Roach Studios, Matthew's 10th birthday was less a celebration than a diagnosis. The cameras which had once caressed his round cheeks and oversized derby hat with affection now began to find flaws. His legs were getting too long. His face was losing the soft, pliable doughiness of infancy and hardening into the angular features of a young man. To the studio executives and to the white American public they served, this biological maturation was a problem. It was a problem because of the specific twisted psychology of Jim Crow racism. White audiences delighted in Stymie as a pickaninny, a harmless, non-threatening caricature of black childhood. He was viewed with the same patronizing affection one might bestow upon a clever pet. He was cute because he was small. He was safe because he was powerless. But as Matthew Beard grew, he began to transform from a pet into something that 1930s America viewed with deep paranoid suspicion, a black male. We must remember the context of 1935. This was an era where the fear of black masculinity was the bedrock of segregationist policy. A black child could be tolerated, even loved, but a black teenager, a black man, that was viewed as a threat to the social order. The transition in the scripts was subtle at first, then undeniable. The writers, who had once given Stymie the wittiest lines, suddenly struggled to write for him. The jokes that sounded adorable coming from a 5-year-old sounded impudent or uppity coming from a 10-year-old. The visual gag of the oversized hat no longer worked because the head underneath it was filling out. Stymie was becoming a person, a distinct individual with dignity and presence. And for the Hollywood machine, that was a fatal error. They didn't want a person, they wanted a type. The axe fell swiftly and silently. There was no farewell episode. There was no goodbye Stymie party with cake and streamers. There was no gold watch for 5 years of service that had generated millions of dollars in revenue. One day, he was on the call sheet. The next day, he wasn't. The brutality of his dismissal was compounded by the speed of his replacement. It was here that Stymie learned the most painful lesson of the industry. He was interchangeable. In the eyes of the studio, Stymie Beard was not a unique talent. He was simply a component in a comedy engine, like a spark plug. When a gear wears out, you don't mourn it, you replace it. Before Stymie's locker was even cleared out, a new child was brought in to fill the quota of the black kid. His name was Billy Buckwheat Thomas. The choice of Buckwheat was telling. Stymie had been known for his slick talk and cool demeanor. Buckwheat, by contrast, was younger, smaller, and was directed to speak with a heavy, garbled speech impediment that the studio found hilarious. The character of Buckwheat represented a regression. Hollywood was moving away from the smart black child back to a safer, more primitive caricature. The seamlessness of this swap was a devastating psychological blow to Matthew. It sent a clear, thunderous message that would echo in his mind for decades. You are not special. You are not loved. You were just a placeholder. The industry that had consumed his entire childhood had chewed him up, extracted every ounce of cute, and spat him out the moment he tasted like an adult. He had an expiration date, and he had just passed it. The crash landing was violent. Stymie went from the insulated, magical world of the movie lot back to the harsh pavement of East Los Angeles. But he was returning as an alien. Imagine the disorientation. For 5 years, he had been the breadwinner, the patriarch in short pants, earning a salary that rivaled bank presidents. He had been chauffeured to work. He had signed autographs. He had been trained to speak, walk, and act in a way that pleased white directors. Now, he was dropped back into a segregated ghetto where survival was a contact sport. He didn't fit in. The local kids in East LA looked at him with a mixture of awe and scorn. He was the Hollywood kid, the sellout, the boy who talked white. He wore suits that were too nice. He had manners that were too polished. He had missed 5 years of street education. He didn't know how to fight. He didn't know the slang. He was a prince exiled from his kingdom, forced to live among subjects who no longer recognized his authority. And then there was the silence. For a child addict, and make no mistake, fame is a drug, the sudden withdrawal of attention is physically painful. Stymie had grown up with the constant dopamine hit of applause, laughter, and validation. He had defined his entire existence by his ability to perform. When the phone stopped ringing, when the agent stopped calling, he was left with a terrifying question. If I am not Stymie, who am I? The financial impact was immediate and catastrophic. The family had spent every dime. There was no savings account to cushion the blow. The Beard family went from relative affluence back to grinding poverty almost overnight. But now there was resentment. The golden goose had stopped laying eggs. The pressure on Matthew didn't disappear. It just curdled into disappointment. He looked at his siblings and saw hungry mouths he could no longer feed. He looked at his parents and saw the panic in their eyes. He felt like a failure at age 10. But Matthew Beard was a fighter. He didn't give up immediately. Throughout his teenage years in the late 1930s and early 1940s, he tried to work. He tried to transition from child star to character actor. And this is where the systemic racism of Hollywood shifted from the pet dynamic to something even more degrading. The cultural climate of Hollywood had changed. The Hays Code was now strictly enforced, clamping down on any representation that might offend moral standards, which often meant Southern sensibilities. The roles available for a teenage black boy in the 1940s were a catalog of humiliation. The scripts that were sent to him, if they were sent at all, were for jungle savages, bug-eyed porters, or cowering servants. The industry that had once celebrated his wit now demanded his degradation. They wanted him to stutter. They wanted him to roll his eyes in exaggerated fear at ghosts. They wanted him to be the butt of the joke. There is a specific haunting memory from this period. Stymie, now a teenager, walked into an audition for a feature film. The director looked at him and said, "Okay, now act scared. Pop your eyes out." Stymie stood there, frozen. He was a professional. He knew timing. He knew delivery. But he didn't know how to reduce himself to a cartoon. He tried to act fear with his face, with his body language. The director stopped him. No, I mean really pop them out like you people do." Matthew refused. He had a pride that had been forged in the fires of his early success. He knew he was talented. He knew he could act circles around many of his white peers. But talent was irrelevant. The color line was absolute. He watched as his former white co-stars like Dickie Moore or Jackie Cooper were given opportunities to grow, to play romantic leads, to become heroes. They were allowed to have a puberty. Stymie was not. He was trapped in a career apartheid. He was too famous to be a normal kid, but too black to be a movie star. There is a specific anecdote that illustrates this painful limbo. At age 16, desperate for money and trying to recapture the magic, Stymie auditioned for a small role in a major studio film, The Return of Frank James. He walked in, wearing his best suit, standing tall, projecting the cool confidence that had made him famous. The casting director looked him up and down, shook his head, and said 3 words that would seal his fate. "You're too smart." It wasn't a compliment. It was a rejection. They didn't want a smart black teenager. They wanted a caricature. They wanted the Stymie of old, or they wanted a fool. They had no use for Matthew Beard, the young man. This continuous rejection created a profound internal void. It is the void of uselessness. For a young man who had defined his worth by his utility, by his ability to provide, being told he was useless was a death of the soul. He felt the weight of his family's poverty crushing him, and he was powerless to lift it. The shame was toxic. He began to internalize the racism of the industry. He began to believe that perhaps they were right. Perhaps he really was nothing. He wandered the streets of Los Angeles, a ghost in his own life. The city was booming with the war effort. Factories were hiring. But Matthew Beard wasn't built for a factory. He was an artist without a canvas. He was a performer without a stage. It was in this state of profound vulnerability, rejected by the white world, alienated from his own community, and haunted by the ghost of his past glory, that he found himself standing on a street corner in the Central Avenue district. It was the jazz hub of Los Angeles, a place of vibrant nightlife, music, and shadows. It was a place where the pain of being a black man in America was transmuted into art, but also numbed by vice. He was 16 years old, tired and hurting. It started with marijuana, a haze to cloud the rejection. But soon the smoke wasn't enough. Waiting for him in the deeper shadows was something darker, a powder that promised total oblivion. Heroin did not just offer a high, it offered an absence. It offered a few hours where he didn't have to be Stymie, didn't have to be the breadwinner, didn't have to be the threat. It filled the hole that the applause had left behind. The expiration date had passed, the pet had been discarded, and the boy was left alone with the wreckage. The stage was set for the final tragic act of his youth. The exit door from reality was open, and Matthew Beard walked right through it. If Hollywood was the dream factory, then Central Avenue in the 1940s was the pharmacy. It was the vibrant, pulsating artery of Black Los Angeles, a place where jazz spilled out of the doorways of the Dunbar Hotel and the Club Alabama. It was a world of sharp suits, dim lights, and smoke. And for a 16-year-old boy who had been chewed up and spat out by the white establishment, it offered the one thing he craved more than fame, more than money, and more than love: silence. Matthew Beard did not stumble into addiction by accident. He walked into it with his eyes wide open, seeking a specific kind of relief. We often make the mistake of viewing drug abuse through the lens of hedonism, assuming that the user is chasing a high, a party, or a thrill. But for the child star who has been discarded, the needle does not offer a thrill. It offers a long sleep. Heroin is a depressant. It slows the heart. It heavies the eyelids. But most importantly for Matthew, it quieted the noise. It turned down the volume on the memories of the Hal Roach lot. It silenced the voice in his head that asked why he wasn't good enough anymore. It blurred the sharp edges of his reality, the poverty of his family, the rejection of the casting directors, the humiliating descent from a national icon to a high school dropout. When the heroin hit his bloodstream, Stymie ceased to exist. The pressure to be funny, to be cute, to be the provider evaporated. In the warm, numb embrace of the opiate, he wasn't a has-been. He wasn't a disappointment. He was just floating. It was a form of chemical suicide, a way to kill the part of himself that was in pain without actually stopping his heart. He spent the next 20 years in this fog. The tragedy of this period is not just the addiction itself, but the context in which it occurred. Stymie was self-medicating a profound trauma, the trauma of child labor, of exploitation, and of abandonment. In a modern context, we might recognize this as a severe case of CPTSD. But in the 1940s, and certainly for a young black man, there was no therapy. There was no rehabilitation center waiting with open arms. There was only the street, and eventually the cage. This brings us to the most infuriating aspect of Matthew Beard's downfall: the double standard of American justice. Hollywood history is littered with the wreckage of child stars who broke under the pressure. When Judy Garland, the darling of MGM, fell into a spiral of pills and alcohol, the studio protected her for as long as they could. When she faltered, the public viewed her with a tragic, weeping sympathy. She was a troubled angel. She was a victim of her own genius. But when Stymie Beard fell, the narrative was different. He was not afforded the luxury of being troubled. He was simply labeled a criminal. The legal system did not see a boy who had been worked to the bone since age 2. They did not see a victim of systemic racism who had been denied an education and a future. They saw a junkie. They saw a threat. And the response to a threat is not treatment. It is incarceration. To support a heroin habit that eventually cost him $50 a day, a staggering sum in the 1940s and 50s, Matthew turned to petty crime. He wasn't a gangster. He wasn't violent. He was a desperate man pawning his possessions, then stealing from grocery stores, then breaking into cars. He was stripping away the last remnants of his dignity to buy a few hours of peace. And so began the cycle of recidivism that would consume his entire adulthood. He entered the penal system as a teenager and didn't truly leave it until he was a middle-aged man. The Los Angeles County Jail, the federal penitentiaries, and the grim fortress-like walls of San Quentin, the state of California, which had once collected taxes on the millions of dollars his films generated, now spent taxpayer money to keep him in a cage. They criminalized his trauma. They took a broken child and punished him for breaking. There is a unique and terrible psychological torture reserved for the famous inmate, for the anonymous prisoner Jail is a place of boredom and violence. But for Stymie Beard, prison was a hall of mirrors where his past was constantly weaponized against him. Imagine walking down the tier of a maximum security prison. You are surrounded by hardened criminals, men convicted of murder, robbery, and assault. And as you walk past the bars, a voice calls out from the shadows, "Hey, Stymie, do the laugh. Where's your hat, little boy? Look at him now. Not so funny anymore, are you?" In the eyes of the guards and the other inmates, he was a celebrity, but a fallen one. He was a curiosity. The guards would point him out to visitors like a zoo animal. "See that guy over there swabbing the floor? That used to be Stymie Beard." The name Stymie became a curse. It was a name that belonged to a ghost. In prison, he was just a number. He was stripped of his identity, forced to wear the denim blues of the state, his head shaved once again, not for a role this time, but for sanitation. The derby hat was gone, replaced by the glare of the watchtower searchlights. This is the ghost in Cell Block C. He was haunted not by a spirit, but by his own former self. Every time someone recognized him, it was a reminder of how far he had fallen. The contrast was agonizing. The image of the innocent, clever boy on the screen was superimposed over the reality of the gaunt, heroin-ravaged man in the cell. He later spoke of the intense shame he felt during these years. He tried to hide. He tried to be invisible, but you cannot hide when your face has been burned into the collective memory of a generation. He was trapped in a paradox. He was famous enough to be mocked, but not powerful enough to be saved. For 20 years, Matthew Beard lived in a revolving door. He would serve his time, dry out in a cold cell, and be released back onto the streets of Los Angeles with a bus ticket and $20 in his pocket. But release is not freedom. When he stepped out of the prison gates, the world had changed. The 1940s turned into the 1950s. The civil rights movement was beginning to stir. New stars were rising. But for Matthew, time stood still. He had no skills. He had no resume. He had a criminal record that made legitimate employment nearly impossible. He would try for a few weeks to stay clean, but the void was still there. The pain was still there. And the society that rejected him as a child certainly had no use for him as an ex-convict. The long sleep would call to him again. The needle offered the only reliable comfort in a hostile world, and inevitably he would find himself back in handcuffs, back in the paddy wagon, headed back to the only place that seemed to have room for him, prison. He missed his 20s. He missed his 30s. Think about what those decades mean for a man. It is the time when you build a career, fall in love, start a family, build a legacy. Matthew Beard spent those prime years staring at concrete walls, counting the cracks in the ceiling. He was frozen in a state of suspended animation. The world marched on, fighting wars, inventing television, going to the moon, and Stymie was stuck in a time loop of addiction and incarceration. His physical appearance began to deteriorate. The vibrant energy of his youth was replaced by the hollowed-out look of long-term opiate abuse. His teeth, once part of that million-dollar smile, began to rot. His skin grew sallow. He was dying by degrees. By the early 1960s, Matthew Beard had reached the absolute bottom. He was in his mid-30s, but he looked like an old man. He was tired. His spirit was broken. He had resigned himself to the fact that he would likely die in prison or in a gutter with a needle in his arm. He had become a cautionary tale, a whisper in the back alleys of Hollywood. Did you hear about Stymie? Yeah, locked up again. It's a shame. But in this darkness, there is a profound truth that we must acknowledge. The system had successfully completed the process. It began in 1935. It had taken a bright, talented, vibrant human being and reduced him to a statistic. It had extracted his labor and discarded the husk. The prison system didn't care about his rehabilitation. It was merely a warehouse for the unwanted. And Stymie Beard, the boy who had once been the most wanted child in America, was now the ultimate unwanted man. As he sat in his cell in the early 60s, shivering through withdrawal, listening to the screams of other inmates echoing off the steel bars, he was completely alone. The laughter of the Little Rascals felt like it belonged to a different universe, a different lifetime. He was a man without a future, and terrifyingly, a man without a past he could bear to look at. He was ready for the long sleep to become permanent. He was ready to fade to black. But fate, it seems, had one final plot twist in store. Just when the light was about to go out completely, a door opened. Not a prison door, but a door to a place that promised something radical, something terrifying, something he hadn't experienced since he was 5 years old. Hope. But before we walk through that door, we must sit here in the dark with Matthew. We must sit with the weight of these 20 wasted years. We must feel the coldness of the cell and the heaviness of the regret. Because only by understanding the depth of the abyss can we truly appreciate the miracle of the climb out. By the mid-1960s, the world was on fire. The civil rights movement was marching across the South. Cities were burning in riots. And a new generation was demanding equality with a ferocity that shook the foundations of America. But inside the mind of Matthew Beard, there was only the cold, static silence of a life, paused. He was 40 years old, but his body, ravaged by 2 decades of heroin and incarceration, carried the weariness of a man twice that age. He had become a ghost in his own city. The lot of fun was a distant memory. The money was gone. The fame had curdled into infamy. He was trapped in a cycle that seemed mathematically impossible to break. Prison, release, addiction, prison. The actuarial tables of the street predicted only one ending for a man like him: a nameless death in a back alley or a final overdose in a cell. But in 1966, teetering on the edge of that oblivion, Matthew Beard made a choice that was perhaps the most courageous act of his life. He didn't choose a role, he chose a rescue. He walked through the doors of Synanon. To the modern ear, the name Synanon evokes images of a controversial cult, but in Santa Monica in the 1960s, it was a radical experiment in human salvage. It was a place of brutal honesty, a drug rehabilitation program that rejected the medical model of addiction. They didn't treat junkies with methadone or pity. They treated them with confrontation. For Stymie, entering Synanon was terrifying. In prison, he had learned to survive by wearing a mask, the mask of the tough guy, the mask of the celebrity, the mask of the victim. Synanon demanded he take it off. The core of the program was the game, a form of aggressive group therapy where members would sit in a circle and verbally dismantle each other's defenses. Imagine the scene. Stymie Beard, the man who had been trained since age 2 to please an audience, sitting in a circle of strangers who didn't care about his movies. They didn't care about the derby hat. They didn't care about the Little Rascals. They looked at him and saw only Matthew, a frightened, broken man hiding behind a legend. When he tried to charm them with his famous smile, they shouted him down. When he tried to blame Hollywood for his addiction, they forced him to look at his own choices. They stripped away the Stymie persona layer by layer until only the raw, trembling human being remained. It was a violent process of rebirth. He had to mourn the boy he never got to be. He had to grieve for the millions of dollars stolen from him. He had to confront the shame of his prison years. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't doing it alone. And for the first time, he wasn't performing. He stayed at Synanon not for weeks, but for years. He worked, he scrubbed floors, he fixed engines. He learned the quiet, profound dignity of labor that had nothing to do with entertainment. He discovered that he had value even when no one was watching. He discovered that Matthew Beard was worth saving, even if Stymie was dead. The man who emerged from that facility in the early 1970s was transformed. He was clean. He was sober. His head was shaved again, not for a role, but as a symbol of his new beginning. The baby fat was long gone, replaced by the deep lines of a survivor. His eyes, once clouded by opiates, were clear and sharp. He returned to Hollywood, but he returned on his own terms. The industry had changed. The rigid segregation of the 1930s had given way to the blaxploitation era. There were more opportunities, though the stereotypes had merely shifted shape. But Matthew wasn't looking for stardom anymore. He wasn't looking to be the king of the lot. He just wanted to work. He wanted to ply his trade as an actor, a craftsman who shows up, does the job, and goes home. He found an ally in Red Fox, another black comedian, who had survived the Chitlin circuit to find late success with Sanford and Son. Fox knew the struggle. He knew the history. He cast Matthew in several episodes, giving him a chance to be funny again, but with a different rhythm. Watch those clips today. You don't see the frantic energy of the child star desperate to please. You see a man who is comfortable in his own skin. You see a man who knows the joke but isn't being the joke. He appeared in the Buddy Holly story in Good Times. These were small roles, a backstage hand, a friend, but they were victories. Every time he walked onto a set sober, hit his mark, and collected a paycheck that actually went into his own pocket, he was winning a war against the system that had tried to erase him. But his most important role in these final years was not on screen. It was as a mentor. Matthew spent much of his time speaking to young people, particularly young actors and kids in at-risk neighborhoods. He didn't hide his scars. He used them as maps. He told them the truth about the dream factory. He told them about the loneliness of the hotel rooms, the false comfort of the needle, and the cold steel of the prison bars. He became a living warning, a canary in the coal mine for a new generation of black talent. He was the survivor who had walked through the fire and come back to say, don't let them consume you. Don't let them define you. You are more than your talent. He had reclaimed his name. He was no longer just Stymie, the prop. He was Matthew Beard, the man. However, the body keeps the score. The decades of malnutrition during the Depression, the years of high-stress labor as a child, and the ravages of 20 years of heroin addiction had taken a toll that no amount of sobriety could fully reverse. His heart was tired. His arteries were hardened. In early January 1981, just days after his 56th birthday, Matthew suffered a massive stroke. He lingered for a few days, surrounded by the few friends and family who had stood by him before slipping away on January 8th. He died young. 56 is no age for a man to leave the world. But we must look at the manner of his death to understand the magnitude of his triumph. He did not die in a prison cell wearing a number. He did not die in a shooting gallery with a needle in his arm. He did not die alone in an alley, unrecognized and unloved. He died in a bed. He died clean. He died free. The state of California, which had imprisoned him for so long, had no claim on his final moments. The Hollywood studios, which had exploited his childhood, had no ownership of his soul. In the end, Matthew Beard belonged only to himself. As we look back on the life of the boy in the derby hat, we are left with a story that is as infuriating as it is heartbreaking. Matthew Beard was the prototype. He was the first clear victim of a phenomenon that would repeat itself again and again in American culture: the disposable black child star. We saw the echoes of his tragedy in the life of Gary Coleman, who sued his parents for misappropriated funds and died young. We saw it in Todd Bridges, who battled the same demons of addiction and incarceration. We saw it in the tortured adulthood of Michael Jackson. Stymie was the warning that we ignored. His life stands as a searing indictment of the entertainment industry. It is a story of economic violence, the theft of a child's labor to feed a desperate family. It is a story of systemic racism, the celebration of a black child as a pet, and the rejection of a black man as a threat. And it is a story of institutional cruelty, the criminalization of a trauma victim by a justice system that preferred to punish rather than heal. They stole his childhood. They stole his millions. They stole his prime years. But they failed in their ultimate objective. They could not turn him into a monster, and they could not erase his humanity. When you watch the Little Rascals today and you see that little boy with the bald head and the oversized hat, smiling that $1 million smile, do not just laugh. Look closer. Look into his eyes. See the intelligence there. See the resilience. See the man he was fighting to become. The hat has been laid down. The stage lights are off. The cell door is open. Matthew Beard has finally gone home. And this time, he walks not as a character, but as a free man.